make their own fortunes. In 1947, Prime Minister Chifley gave Menzies the boost he needed.
A crowd of more than 10,000 listened to speakers of the Bank Officers Association protesting against the Chifley government's plan to nationalise banks.
I think everybody voted Labor in 1943. Maybe I wasn't old enough to vote, I was so stupid. But to vote Labor, by the time I got discharged in 1946, I voted Labor again. Then I went to university and Chifley decided to nationalise banks. Well, no bugger was going to tell me where I was going to bank. We thought we'd been fighting for the four freedoms. And we had this bunch of socialist lunatics in Canberra who thought they were going to control every bit of our life. So there was a jack-up.
Rolling strikes in industry after industry were disrupting production throughout the country as we moved into 1949. Worst hit were the coal fields. This subversive and very active policy of the Communist Party was being intensified, centering in New South Wales. Mines were at a standstill, but at mass meetings on the fields, the insidious red propaganda was at peak production, feeding the thousands of unemployed.
An election was due in 1949. The tide ran against a government beset by rationing, the bank issue and the coal strike. The public had not learned to love Menzies, but they didn't need to.
A big swing against the Labor government has taken place. In the state of Queensland, Labor has so far only won 4 seats against...
I remember that 49 election night very well. I came home from the pictures, as we call them, with Mum and Dad and one of my brothers, and my eldest brother was there, and he excitedly said, "We've won," and the biggest swing's been in Queensland. Dad was particularly happy because he owned a garage and it was the end of petrol rationing.
It was jubilant. It was great excitement. I imagine very much like 1972 when Whitlam came in with its time. It was time and it was exciting and it was wonderful.
In conjunction with their country party allies, the Liberals had won a 27-seat majority.
We represent all the people, not just the ones who voted for us, but the ones who voted against us. And that the real thing that we have to produce in Australia is not only national prosperity, but national unity.
Governing for all Australians raised the question of what to do with the legacy of the just-opposed Labor government.
The greatest substantial authority that a Prime Minister has is in the creation of policy.
In fact, many post-war initiatives had already been set in place by Labor. Migration, the Snowy Mountains scheme, soldier resettlement. But there was a change of emphasis.
Now, what is the value of this middle class so defined and described? First, it has a stake in the country. It has responsibility for homes. Homes material, homes human, homes spiritual.
We believed that home ownership was one of the key differences between the Socialists and the Liberal Party at the 49 election. Deadman, in the Chifley government, said more than once, we don't want to build in Australia a whole mass of little capitalists.
If Labor didn't want little capitalists, the Liberals did. Banks were given tax breaks in return for lending to first home buyers. There were new suburbs, new electorates, new middle-class voters.
There were things about that period that provided people with reassurance and hope. And one of the great success stories of that period was the way in which we enthusiastically absorbed so many migrants from Europe. You meet them now in middle and old age talking very enthusiastically and passionately. I struck them the other night at a Greek ball. They talked about how they were received into Australia and they were given a chance. And they love those years because the contrast was so stark from war-devastated Europe.
You see, under a communist government, you're pushed around. And if you don't like it, that's just too bad. Because
By 1950, the international Cold War was underway.
Today in Australia, Reds openly preach their gospel, flout our laws, and...
In Australia, Communist Party membership had halved since the war, but communists maintained strong influence in trade
There was
unions.
very little humour on the wharves. Big Jim Healy, boss of the Waterside Workers' Federation, had banned loading of ships to New Zealand. He was sentenced to 6 weeks' jail and fined on 4 charges of interfering with trade across the Tasman.
There was a feeling of almost of crisis in the community because these communists had really set out to take charge and something had to be done about them except words.
Menzies introduced a bill to outlaw the Communist Party. It aimed at a blacklist of Marxist sympathisers to be banned from any government or union job. It raised an important question. How liberal was the Liberal Party?
We had lots of party meetings about whether or not the Communist Party should be outlawed or declared illegal. And it was a very difficult one, because what were you going to do with people who defied the ban? You can't put people in jail for having certain opinions. You can for expressing them, of course. And that wasn't very nice either.
On June 25th at 4 a.m., the North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, and the battle was on. The free nations...
Menzies would defend the bill as a security measure, saying that the government expected the Korean War to escalate into a global anti-Soviet war within 3 years.
The world needs the United States of America. The world needs the British peoples of the world. The world needs every scrap of democratic strength that can be found in it.
Meanwhile, Labour was hopelessly split by the bill, opposing then supporting it. Liberals could scent the division in Labour ranks.
The Communist Party existence was of great political value to us because, generally speaking, Australians were frightened of them, didn't trust them, and we used their presence and their affiliation with the left wing of the Labour Party to a very great advantage.
Members of the Communist Party from all states protest against the anti-Red Bill, aimed at dissolving the Australian Communist Party. They challenged the Act, and after a 23-day hearing before 7 judges of the High Court, the Anti-Red Act was declared to be constitutionally invalid. It was a victory for the Communist Party and Party Chairman Sharkey, who had just...
Days after the High Court decision, Menzies obtained a double dissolution.
As the first returns are posted in the tally room, radio and newspaper correspondents flash figures throughout Australia. The Liberal Country Party has returned to office with the loss of only a few seats.
Hundreds of thousands lined the streets in capital cities to watch the Jubilee procession. New Australians from all over
The
Europe
election was the year that the Commonwealth celebrated its Jubilee.
displaying enthusiasm for their new country.
The Liberal-controlled Parliament gathered for a festive ball.
Menzies was in charge of proceedings in King's Hall and Parliament House, where there was a glittering crowd for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Federation.
And Chifley said, I'm going to be in bed reading a whodunit. He didn't go to the ball.
I was standing outside the entrance to the House of Reps about 9:30 or 10, with all the splendour of this magnificent function on, and Everett put his head around the corner and said, Fred, I want to see you. Oh, I said, don't worry me now, Doc. I'm about to go and have a dance. No, he said, you've got to come with me. Chifley's dying.
Menzies had to go to the microphone and announce this publicly. I think he began, ladies and gentlemen, it is my melancholy duty to announce to you that the leader of the opposition, Mr. Chifley, has just died.
Menzies was quite white. You know, personally, he had liked Chifley. And, well, it was a very sad occasion. It converted what had been quite bright into something desolating.
I was very annoyed. I thought it was a terribly shocking time to die when you were having a middle of a dance for us. It seemed a terrible thing to do.
it's the last kick of the Labour Party. But don't forget that was just after I'd been elected, and I had a different view now, but that would be the sort of thing that I thought then, yes.
Chifley was a remarkable man. He had no formal education, as you and I would understand that expression. And yet he had the most acute mind.
My father was really very sad when Chifley died. Things were very different in those days. And there was not the same animosity between people on different sides of the house.
It was a political watershed. The mood in Canberra changed dramatically. Chifley was replaced as leader of the opposition by Herbert Vere Evatt.
But politically, from the time he came in, I disliked him and distrusted him. And one's entitled to dislike people.
Each loathed the other. Evatt could perhaps lay claim to intellectual credentials greater than those of Menzies, but Evatt was a poor speaker and debater in Parliament. Menzies was brilliant. Menzies could trounce Evatt in debate. Menzies resented Evatt's intellectual accomplishments, I think, and Evatt resented Menzies' golden speech.
The only thing I can remember my father saying about, talking about Evatt once, was he said, I wish I'd done a doctorate, got a doctorate, and then we could both be doctors.
The first battle between the leaders took place within weeks. Menzies reintroduced the Communist Bill, modified into a referendum. Evatt tirelessly travelled the country advocating a no vote. But the referendum also caused ructions within the Victorian Liberal Party. Young Liberals campaigned against the measure, led by their Vice President, Alan Misson.
He was, of course, immensely affronted, as I think we all were, by what was going on in America at the time with McCarthyism, which if it hadn't been happening, you couldn't have believed. And the idea that we should follow any such similar pattern, he just thought was totally undemocratic, totally unnecessary and totally absurd.
Alan Misson was a born rebel, and he found it very hard to do the work that he was required to do when he got onto the executive. So much so that in the end I moved for his suspension from the executive. And he was suspended for quite some time.
Alan, throughout his political life, stood for a view of politics and of liberal politics, which in my opinion, and of course I'm biased, but it is my considered opinion, was immensely important to the Liberal Party. It's often referred to as small L liberalism.
I had nothing against Misson personally, but I could see that if he was allowed to go on that way, we'd never get anywhere.
Throughout Alan's career, there were always people who would make remarks like Mr. Anderson, which I think to a degree, I mean, such views were, of course, very sincerely held, but I think all of this is reflecting is two entirely different views of what the party should be like.
Most Liberals supported a yes vote. On the eve of the poll, newspaper magnate Frank Packer personally wrote an advertising banner. But neither Menzies nor Packer had judged the electorate accurately. The referendum narrowly failed its required majority in New South Wales, South Australia and Victoria.
Menzies was bitter about losing the anti-communist referendum. And I remember leaving the Hotel Australia in Sydney and driving with him out to the airport on Sunday morning after the defeat. And I recall him saying to me, well, my boy, that's the last referendum I will ever put to the people of Australia.
What was your reaction when you found that you'd lost the referendum, only very narrowly, but that it had been lost?
Well, I did what I always did in my prime ministerial life. I had dinner, I got into bed, and as I told my parson once, I said, you'll be shocked by this, but when I'd got into bed and had read a book for a while, I used to say to myself, to hell with them, and put my head on the pillow and go to sleep. Mr. Khrushchev said, among other things,
Anti-communism continued as a major theme.
Nations who oppress other nations cannot themselves be free.
It underpinned the Liberal achievement of a post-war defence structure linking Australia with America, New Zealand and Southeast Asia.
To win freedom and independence.
And domestically, it was good politics. Before the 1954 election, the Liberals were trailing when a Red Scare broke again.
In the House of Representatives, the Prime Minister announced that Vladimir Petrov, third Secretary of the Russian Embassy, has approached Australian security men and sought asylum. This had been granted. The news of a spy ring which might involve Australian nationals shocked the nation. Mrs. Petrov, firmly gripped by the two Russians, is partly assisted, partly dragged towards the plane. She is obviously...
I stood under the tail of the plane on the airport.
Mrs. Petrov, up to this point, has not sought asylum in Australia.
And the crowd, some of them were yelling, "Stay, Petrova," and some were yelling, "Go home, Petrova." And they pulled the gangplank away from the plane.
She looks back for one instant as if beseeching help and is then forced further up the gangway.
And as I was there, I looked up and I looked her full in the face and I knew what she was feeling. And I also knew that if she went, the election would have been lost. So I went back and I rang up the lodge. At that stage, the cabinet was having its end of session dinner. I think they were all fairly well primed. I subsequently heard that there was a debate at the dinner table. Some people, particularly McEwen, said, "Do nothing, let her go." Menzies, however, came round to the position that something had to be done. A message was sent to the plane.
Everyone now knows what happened 7 hours later in Darwin. There Mrs. Petrov sought asylum in Australia and it was granted. The Russian diplomats went on to Russia.
Mrs. Petrov's rescue helped the Liberals to their third election victory. Its aftermath was to decimate Labour. Petrov alleged members of Evatt's staff were Soviet contacts.
He went a bit odd over all that business. Evatt really lost his balance over this matter.
Evatt turned on anti-communists inside his own party. Some were expelled. A mostly Catholic right-wing split off to form the Democratic Labour Party, a gift to the Liberals.
There wasn't much point in starting a party which became the DLP. If you then gave it second preferences to the Labor Party, they would flow back. You might as well not have started. So to be effective, you had to give your second preferences to the Liberals in order to ensure that Labor didn't come to power.
Once again, the DLP's second preferences went to the Liberals, and that virtually...
4 out of 5 DLP preferences, former Labor votes, flowed to the Liberals. The Liberal Party went out of its way to support its new electoral allies.
There were occasions where I raised money for them separately. I would go to selected people whom I knew well. I'd explain the situation to them. I would say it was absolutely essential that we had the DLP preferences. If we didn't have them, we couldn't win government or we couldn't retain government. And 9 times out of 10, they would give me an amount, maybe 500, maybe 1,000.
Vote for the lively DLP candidates, and in doing so...
Voting figures suggest that without DLP preferences, the coalition may have lost every election from 1958 to 1975.
Pensioners protest and unemployment figures rise. The politicians are not winning any popularity poll here.
Even with DLP preferences, the Liberals had a scare against Everett's successor Caldwell in 1961.
And the credit squeeze starts.
We were devastated here in Queensland. Menzies held up throughout the rest of Australia. We lost seats galore. On the Saturday night, election night, I was a certain Labor gain. No less an authority than the then Australian Broadcasting Commission had me as down and out, gone and forgotten. I wasn't so sure.
Well, Jim was an ardent anti-communist. There were a number in the Parliament when I first went in, but when the election of 1961 came along, and the result dragged on for about 10 days, it all hinged on Jim Killen's seat, and in the end he won by Communist Party preferences, only by 100 or so votes. But for some strange reason, we never heard Jim make another anti-communist speech after that.
Liberals reacted quickly to their near miss. Their main priority was to regain business confidence.
I want the Tariff Board to bear in mind in the first place that it is an advisory authority, it's not a policy-making instrument of government.
Country Party Trade Minister John McEwen was allowed to give special trade protection to manufacturing, a policy which would outlast Menzies and continue right through the 1960s.
One of the serious consequences of Sir Robert Menzies' neglect, if you like, or failure to cultivate big business was that Sir John McEwen and the Country Party had gained enormous influence with big business and were sometimes successful in pressuring the government in directions, particularly with regard to tariffs, which might not necessarily have been in Australia's for Australia's good as a whole.
I can remember in Cabinet that there was a Tariff Board report brought down giving an unanswerable case that a certain industry in a country town should be closed down, woolen industry. It was costing Australian consumers a fortune to keep this alive. The Member of Parliament for that area, that happened to be the Deputy Prime Minister, John McEwen, said, "This is not going to go through. This report is not going to be accepted because it will cost me dearly electorally in Wangaratta." And we're talking about the Wangaratta woolen mills and bruck mills. And he won without a fight. That's political realism, I suppose, but very bad government.
Any city like Sydney is a hub of commerce as well as a congregation of homes.
In response to business pressure, Menzies also set up a committee to investigate the economy.
Any big store is a clearinghouse for the varied wonders of every land. Italian textiles, Eastern silks, and Australian wool.
The Vernon Committee sat for 2 years and produced the most comprehensive economic analysis of Australia since Federation.
Mere husbands may grumble at fashion, but Milady's whims mean jobs for designers, tanners, and salespeople.
Menzies dumped it as too restrictive on policy making.
His main objection to the Vernon report were proposals relating to target rates of growth, target migration numbers, to the establishment of an advisory body which would look at the medium and long-term aspects of economic policy. I think politicians live from one election to another, and getting hooked into policies which are too long-term, certainly on the economic side, makes life difficult for them. And Menzies was not given to long-term views on economic matters.
Whatever his economic record,